welcome. I'm reaching out to you guys from Jerusalem, capital of Jewish people. And as you heard in my introduction, I'm a tour guide, do food tours. I'm also working on a book about Jewish food as a window into Jewish cultural history. And when I tell people I'm working on a book about Jewish food, one of the common questions is, what is Jewish food? Or sometimes more declaratory, there is no such thing as Jewish food. And I would beg to differ on that. I think that very much there is such a thing as Jewish food. There are many things that might qualify something as Jewish food. And on top of that, there's certainly foods that are uniquely Jewish foods. For example, what we're all going to be enjoying in about a week and a half, matzah. If there's any non-Jew who's eating matzah and enjoying it, then they're nuts, okay? Clearly, that is a uniquely Jewish food. And to my view, Chulent and Hamin and all of the different Shabbat stews are another excellent example of a uniquely Jewish food. And when I say that in the singular, another example, I mean that. And that's what I'm going to be looking at right now. When we look at this food, it is something that we can use to trace the routes of our diaspora and the differences between the different communities and the changes. So in 1949, Joseph Campbell, the famous mythologist, published a book called The Hero with a Thousand Faces. And in it, he looked at all of world mythology, and he saw that basically, more often than not, they were retelling the same story. It's a story that's become known as the hero's journey. One story with alterations for time and place, and he referred to it as a mono-myth. It was one hero with many different versions, so it was the hero with 1,000 faces. When I look at the Shabbat stew, to me, it is a mono dish. It is one food with multiple variations. It is the stew with 1,000 flavors. So I want to begin with three brief examples, of some of these Shabbat stews that will give you a taste, no pun intended, but it'll give you a taste of how diverse these seem on the surface. So I'm going to start with perhaps the one that many of us are most familiar with, a Polish Chulent. Okay, Polish Chulent, the primary ingredients would be beef, potatoes, onions, barley, and beans, what we would refer to as haricot beans, meaning not things like chickpeas or lentils or fava beans, things like kidney beans or white beans or things of that nature. That is Polish Chulent. The second example is Moroccan schina. That would be made typically with lamb, with wheat, sweet potatoes, chickpeas, dates, and eggs. And the third example I will give you now is from Bukhara, from Uzbekistan, Bukharian oshi sabo. Oshi sabo is made with rice, chicken, sometimes potatoes or onions, and things such as prunes or dried apricots, green apple, things of that nature. Tomatoes also. So with these different stews, you see that on the surface, they seem quite different, okay? So first of all, they have different names, completely different names. They have different ingredients. And yet, they're actually not as different as they seem. First of all, those different ingredients break down into a classic trio. All of them have a type of meat, they all have a type of grain, and they all have a type of vegetable, okay? Basically, it's a balanced meal in one pot. Secondly, the cooking method is common to all of them. That basically, you'll see that all of them are prepared before Shabbat started cooking and then cook through the night, eaten at lunch the next day. And although less universal, when we look at the different names of these different stews, while they're not all the same, even when they sound different, many of them repeat the same themes. And that's what we're going to be exploring here. So I want to start by looking at the ingredients. And for that, I'm going to go to a map of the world. I'll be cutting back and forth with this periodically throughout the session. So here's the world. One second here. Okay, well, I'll leave it at that. So basically, the Jewish people begin in this region right over here, right around Israel, which is right where my arrow is. And then we spread out around the Middle East over here. But as the Jews spread throughout the diaspora, there are three main centers through most of our history. We have the area over here in Central Asia. I hope you all can see the screen okay. Over here, we have North Africa. And then over here, we have Europe. And when we look at, for example, the grains of the Shabbat stews, traditionally, the stews of Asia will use rice. That was an ancient grain and it was common in the region. However, rice requires a lot of water, of which there's not much of it here in North Africa. And so in North Africa, most of the stews there make use of wheat of some variety. It may be bulgur, it might be wheat berries, it might be frika, maybe even leftover couscous. And in Europe, and I'll explain later a little bit more why, but in Europe, we get barley as the primary ingredient. Actually, I'll describe now the reason, because barley is something that grows very good in a bad climate. So even in Central and Northern and Eastern Europe, where it's very cold, you can still grow it, and you don't even need to plow very much for it. So that made it the grain of choice over there. The meats break down also by region, although less exclusively. Basically, here in Asia, it is primarily chicken. In North Africa, primarily lamb, and in Europe, primarily beef. Okay, so that's a little bit about that. And in addition, what I want to talk about is just to point out, and I'm going to return to this later, but of those three examples I gave you, some of the ingredients you heard were potatoes, sweet potatoes, tomatoes, haricot beans, all New World foods. That means that none of them existed anywhere in the region I just showed you until at the earliest, the end of the 15th century. And yet, now they're all considered part of the traditional foods that we're eating. So that's just something to file away for the current time.